I'm Chris Hatchie, and I would like to welcome you to building your first room in UDK. In this tutorial, we'll be going over using an entirely additive building system to construct your basic geometry for your first UDK room. So when you first load up UDK, you'll get a window that looks something like this. We don't want to actually build in this area here. This is kind of just like a little demo they put up. So we've come up to File, go to New, and then we want to choose Blank Map. Alright, so now we should have this empty canvas, which is what we'll use to construct on. So there are some tools I'd like to talk about here. We have our cube, our cone, our cylinder. We have staircase options, and we have this sphere. So first off, I'm going to tell you guys one thing. These stairs, you never want to use them. They are pretty much completely useless and cause a whole bunch of unnecessary BSP geometry that will cause heavier engine calculations, and they're just not needed. Same goes for the sphere. Plane is sometimes used, or sheet. Very rarely will I use cone. I mostly use cylinder and cube to build everything that I need for a basic blockout. So what I want to start with here is if you click this brush once, you'll notice we have a little red cube here, and that's our builder brush. The builder brush controls the BSP. So if I was to grab this builder brush and hit Control A, you'd see it adds a little cube in, just like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to delete this because I don't need it at the moment. And you'll notice I just deleted that. It deleted from my side views, but yet it's still here. Why is that? Well, that's because BSP does not function in real time. It has to be built in order to either disappear or reappear. In order to get this to fully disappear out of our level, we have to come up here and choose Build Geometry. And as soon as we build that, it now disappears. So before we get started here, I'm building our first room. I want to talk about the importance of this snapping grid right here. This is one of the most important features in UDK. When working with geometry, you always want to make sure that this little checkbox here is checked. And I usually work on a grid size of between 16, 8, sometimes 32, but I very rarely will go under 8. And this is very important when working with BSP, because if you notice how this builder brush snaps to these grids, you always want to make sure when you're constructing BSP that it's always on grid. So why don't we get started with building this here. I'm going to right click on the cube, and this will bring up our builder brush cube properties. We have X, Y, Z, wall thickness. This is only used if you have hollow turned on. I don't recommend using hollow, but it is a quick way to get a square room, but we will not be using hollow in this case. So my X is 256, my Y is 256, and I'm going to set my Z to 32. Now you notice the builder brush took a shape here. And I'm also going to up my X and Y to 512 and 512 and hit build. Right now we got a little bit of a little sheet to work with here. I'm going to kind of drop this down a little bit so it's closer to UDK's origin. Alright, so you can either hit Control A on the keyboard to add, or you can come up here to where it says CSG, and this first option here is CSG add. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add. And I'm going to move the builder brush here just out of the way for a second so you can kind of see what's going on here. So now we have a little plane or a floor piece. Before I get too involved in building here, I'm going to come up here to our content browser, and I'm going to come into the UT3 folder here, and I'm going to turn on just skeletal meshes. And what I'm looking for here is I'm either looking for cathode or iron guard male A, and I'm going to use this as a scaling tool so that I know roughly about how big my doors and my windows are when I'm working at my level. So I'm going to make sure iron guard male is selected. I'm going to right click on top of this surface and do add skeletal mesh iron guard. Alright. I'm going to go ahead and close this down and come into a side view now, and I'm going to drag him up so that he's roughly on the floor. You'll notice his feet are kind of going through just a little bit. I'm going to come down here to my snapping grid and drop it to 8. I'm going to see if he's not going to line up perfectly. See if I drop it even lower. You know what? I don't like that. I'm just going to leave his feet going through the floor a little bit. I don't know why I always try to go through and line it up perfectly when I know it's not going to work with this particular character. But he's roughly the same size as our character. So now that I can kind of see how big this is, I'm going to kind of move the builder brush off to the side here. I don't need it for the moment. The great thing with this geometry is we can edit its vertices manually. So I'm going to come into the top view here. I'm going to click on geometry mode or shift 2. And now if I hold down Control and Alt, I can mouse over vertices and grab them. So I'm going to grab these two vertices that are behind him here, and I'm going to drag them out just a little bit here. So I'm making more of a room for him to sit on here. Just like that. So now I'm going to come back to camera mode or shift 1. Pop back down to a side view, and you'll notice here I have what I talked about earlier. I drug it out, and the brush is now larger, but yet we don't see it. And that's just because we have to make sure we come up here and do build geometry. Anytime you make any change to BSP, you must come up here and hit build geometry. And if you keep working and you don't do build geometry, you may have stuff all over the place, or stuff maybe way off over here in the distance and you didn't know it, and you think you're building right here, and then when you come up and hit build geometry, some of your stuff moves way over here, which you don't want that. You want to make sure you're religiously building geometry every time you make a change. And so now what I'm going to do is in camera mode here, I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to drag this up. And what holding down Alt does is it's UDK's version of a duplicate. Anytime you Alt drag something, it's going to make a copy. So if I do it again, we just made another copy. Now if I rebuild geometry, you'll see now that I have 3 of these planes. This middle one here, I'm going to go ahead and delete it now and rebuild again. And so now we start to construct kind of like a roof here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this wall piece one more time, hold down Alt and drag it. Then I'm going to go into my rotation mode, which by tapping spacebar once, I'll get the rotation widget up. And I can come in here. I'm going to rotate this roughly 90 degrees. Hit spacebar 2 more times to get back into move mode. Drag this over to our side here. And I'm going to drag it down to match. Now this is really important that you need to understand with building with geometry, is you only want your BSP to be right at the borders of each other. So what I mean by that is when I drag this piece to connect the wall, that it just lines up just with the edge. You do not want something like this. Now what this is doing right now is this piece of BSP is going through this piece of BSP. And that is just very bad. So if we come over here and we go to brush wireframe in a perspective view, you can really see what this is doing. And you can see that we have intersecting pieces of BSP. And you want to avoid intersecting BSP at all costs, because it will cause you lots of problems and headache. And it could cause UDK to even crash at some point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drag this over just so it's on just the edge, and I'll shift back into perspective view so you can see what that looks like. And so now if we look at this in perspective view, we notice they're just touching on just their very edges, and that's exactly what we want. We do not want them to overlap whatsoever. So now coming back into a side view here, we'll notice this piece is really too tall, so I'm going to hit Shift 2, come back into geometry mode here, hold down Control and Alt, drag this roof piece down, well, not roof, but wall, so it matches up with the roof here. Just like that. I'm going to switch over to the top view to make sure everything is alright. So now our wall piece lines up perfectly. So now I'm going to hold down, well, I'm not going to hold down anything. I'm actually just going to come up here and click Rebuild Geometry. Now we notice we got a wall section here. So what I'm going to do is come back into camera mode. I am going to hold down Alt. We'll come into the side view and do this. I'm going to hold down Alt and drag this wall over. Just like that. I'm going to come back into perspective, do a build geometry. So now we got this wall piece built. I'm going to hold down Alt in this top view here and drag it out just so I get another piece. I'm going to toggle back into my rotation mode by hitting spacebar. Give this another 90-degree rotation. Back into move mode here. Line this up where it needs to go. I'm going to jump back into perspective view and take a look here. And you'll notice this piece is a little too long. You can see it here in the top view as well. So I'm going to need to go and hit Shift 2. Grab these verts and drag them back. And now rebuild geometry. And the thing I want to make note of here before we go too much further is building geometry and BSP and UDK is not a substitute for a 3D modeling package. BSP is meant to be simple, blocky shapes. You do not want to get complex with it. And it's for good reason. What we're seeing here with this BSP is an initial block out of what we could turn into a game level, and then that block out is later exported out of UDK and imported into a 3D modeling package like Maya or 3D Studio Max, and from there you build your wall pieces and your other supporting props that get added to the scene later on. And then the BSP will just later disappear. We'll delete it, or we'll turn pieces of it into blocking volumes. But that's a discussion for another topic. I just want to make sure you guys aren't trying to model really complex shapes using BSP, because this is not the time and place for it. Alright, so we got pretty much the starting of our first room here, but I do want to make this wall have a hallway so we can travel between two areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this wall piece that we just made here in my top view. I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to drag it over just like so. And now I'm going to kind of grab our little character that we have here. I'm going to drag him closer to the wall. Right, and I'm going to kind of get him lined up with the middle. So I kind of want the hallway right about here. So now I'm going to jump back into my top view. I'm going to grab my wall piece here. I'm going to hit Shift 2 to get into geometry mode. And now I'm going to grab this piece and I'm going to drag it over. See, right about here. I'm going to kind of look at this. And you know what? I'm going to go a little bit further over so it's a little bit wider. So see, now when I click on this piece of geometry, you'll notice the pivot's over here. You could leave the pivot and still work with it here, or if you're picky, kind of how I get sometimes, if you right click on this vertice, it will snap the pivot there. And if you right click again, and you come into pivot, you do save pivot. Okay, so now if you click here, our pivot's back in place. So I'm going to come back into my perspective view, rebuild geometry. Alright, so there we go. Got a half wall here. I'm going to come back into top view, hold down Alt, drag this one over here. I'm going to come back into perspective view here and rebuild my geometry. Alright, so now we have a start here of a hallway. So now I'm going to go back into my top view here. I'm going to hold down Alt and drag another piece over. Hit Shift 2 to get into geometry mode. Control and Alt to select my vertices. Drag this wall piece over so it matches up here. I'm going to now come back and come into a front view. I'm going to kind of keep my perspective view open at the same time so I can kind of watch what's going on here. But I want to make this into an actual doorway, so I'm going to grab these bottom verts and I'm going to drag them up a little bit here. Right about there. And I just kind of messed those up there. Alright, so I accidentally drug this out in a different view here, so I have to correct this in a side view. There we go. So I'm going to rebuild my geometry. I'm going to hit Shift 1 to get into camera mode. Now we can see we have the basis of our first room. We have a doorway. What else is needed? Well, we need to have some sort of light in here so that we can see where we're going when we actually come into the world. So if you hold down L and left click, that will make a point light. And we can just then drag this up into our level a little bit. I can come up here and I can hit rebuild. I'm going to hit build all. And that's just going to build all our lighting calculations really quick here. Alright, we got our log window, and there we are. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down. Now I can right click in the level and select play from here. Now that dropped us into our level. Now we can kind of take a look around here. And kind of run around. See our doorway. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Control and Alt, and I'm going to drag over everything we have here. Now that's selected everything we have, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to Control click our little character so he's deselected. Now on my top view, I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to drag a duplicate of everything we have, just like that. I'm going to go into rotation mode. I'm going to spin everything around 90 degrees, or in this case actually it's going to be 180. Just like that. Now we'll notice we have a problem here. Everything got off grid, which we do not exactly want to happen. So there is a selection method that we can do to fix this really quick. So I'm going to select all of my vertices. I'm going to right click on one of the lines of along the lines here, or the edges. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to transform, snap vertices to grid, and there, as you see, it snapped all of our vertices back to our grid. And now we can come into our front view here, and we can get these doorways lined back up. So I'll move back into a move mode here by hitting spacebar. Hit Shift 1 to get out of geometry mode. I'm going to rebuild my geometry. So now we have another room over here that we can't get to yet. So in this case, I'm going to come back to my builder brush since it's closer to the shape I'm looking for and size, and I'm going to kind of just get it lined up into position in our top view here. Hit Shift 2 to get into geometry mode, Control and Alt to select, and I'm going to get it roughly the size of our hallway here. Shift 1 to get out of geometry mode, and make sure it's in the right place. And if you notice here, I actually didn't make it long enough because I was lining it up with the outside wall. And if we look here, there's actually a gap here. So if I add this, hit Control A, you'll notice there's a gap in between the floor here, and that's just because I didn't drag it far enough when I made it. So I'm going to come back into my top view, Shift 2 to get in geometry mode, Control and Alt to drag, and then I'm just going to move this into place here. And it looks like it's actually overlapping, but it's actually not. That's just, we're seeing the roof portions here. they overhang a little bit. So now I'm going to hit my rebuild geometry. And in my top view, or my front view here, I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to drag this up. And that should do that. And actually, I want to drag this up higher. So I don't want my roof to be this low. So I'm going to drag the hallway portion up. And now this hallway piece is actually going through its intersecting geometry. So we do need to fix this. Because we do not want that intersecting geometry at all. So I'm going to hit Shift 2 to get back into geometry mode. I'm going to drag this piece out here and this piece to here. I'm going to pop back into camera mode and rebuild my geometry. And everything is good there. I'm actually going to hold down L and left click again to add another light. I'm going to go into rotation mode here and just bring the light's radius down because it doesn't need to be that big. I'm just going to kind of move it into position here. Now I just need to add my walls in. So looking at these wall pieces here, I should be able to reuse the roof piece that we just created for this hallway. So I'm going to go into my front view here, hold down Alt and drag, spacebar to get into rotation mode. I'm just going to do a 90-degree rotation here, back into move mode, and then I'm going to snap it right to here. I'm going to kind of jump into this mode here, see how that's looking. It looks pretty good, except I am going to go into geometry mode and move these so they line up with the correct pieces. Back into camera mode, jump back here and hit rebuild geometry. I'm going to hold down Alt and duplicate this over to the other side, rebuild geometry. And now I'm going to hit a build all so that it builds the lighting. Okay, there we are. So now I'm going to right click on our level, do play from here. Now you'll notice we have two rooms that are joined together. And this will conclude our building with BSP in an additive environment. Thank you guys for watching.